They say you're carrying a married man's child, the freight clerk said. And before Lillian Hayes could answer, George Mercer stepped between her and the watching town and asked one dangerous question. Who started the story? Lillian's trunk was already sitting in the mud outside the Pine Creek boarding house when she learned the rumor had cost her both her room and her job. She didn't beg anyone to believe her. She picked up her scattered hairpins, opened her valise, and checked the freight receipts she planned to take to the county clerk. One was missing. Across the street, George Mercer watched her close the case and realized the town might be looking at the wrong scandal. Stay with Lillian and tell me, would you leave town or find out who wanted you gone? Lillian Hayes knew something was wrong before she reached the bottom step. Her trunk sat on the porch of the Pine Creek boarding house with one brass latch hanging open. Beside it lay her brown valise, tipped against the railing. 2 hairpins rested in the dust below. The sun had barely cleared the eastern rim of Juniper Valley. Overnight rain still darkened the wagon ruts along Main Street, and water dripped from the boarding house roof into a dented wash bucket. Lillian stopped. She had packed neither trunk nor valise. Behind her, the front door opened. Mrs. Talbot stood there with both hands folded over her apron. What happened to my things? The older woman looked past Lillian toward the street. The other boarders don't want trouble under the same roof. What trouble? Mrs. Talbot swallowed. You ought to ask at the freight office. Lillian bent and picked up the first hairpin, then the second. A third lay beneath the porch rail. She wiped each one against her glove and slipped them into her coat pocket. Across the street, a man carrying a milk pail slowed down. 2 women outside the bakery stopped talking. Lillian straightened. Did you go into my room? I had your things brought down. That wasn't what I asked. Mrs. Talbot finally met her eyes. Go speak to Mr. Avery. The door closed. Lillian stood there another second, then lifted the valise. It felt lighter than it had the night before. She looked at it, but didn't open it. Not yet. The Pine Creek Freight Office stood 2 doors beyond Pike Freight and Supply, a narrow building with a loading platform out back and a painted sign faded by Wyoming wind. By the time Lillian reached it, 4 men had found reasons to linger nearby. Mr. Avery was waiting behind the counter. He didn't offer her the coffee steaming beside his ledger. Morning, Miss Hayes. Mrs. Talbot told me to see you. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the counter. I think it'd be best if you didn't work today. A wagon rolled past outside. Nobody inside spoke until its wheels faded. Avery lowered his voice. There's talk. What talk? His eyes shifted toward the window. Lillian waited. Finally, he said, They're saying you're with child. For a moment, the only sound was the clock above the freight shelves. Tick, tick. Lillian set her valise on the floor. Who is they? Avery blinked. They're also saying the father is a married man. Name him. I don't know that anybody. If a man has been named, tell me his name. No man that I've heard. Then who told you? Avery's face tightened. Miss Hayes, I'm trying to keep this from becoming uglier. No. You're telling me I cannot work because somebody told you a story. I'm asking where the story came from. Someone outside coughed. Avery looked toward the door. Mrs. Colton said she heard it yesterday evening. From whom? I believe one of the stable boys. Which one? I don't know. Lillian drew a small notebook from her coat and opened it. Avery stared at her. What are you doing? Yesterday evening. Mrs. Colton. Stable boy. She wrote each down. When did you hear it? About 7. Before or after the Cheyenne freight came in? Before. She wrote that too. Then she closed the notebook. Her appointment with Deputy County Clerk Daniel Shaw was at 10 o'clock the next morning. Only Avery knew she had requested time away from the office for it. Or she had thought only Avery knew. I'll collect the wages owed me through yesterday. I'm not dismissing you. Then I'll collect them when I return. A shadow crossed the doorway. Edwin Pike entered wearing a clean brown coat despite the muddy street. At 49, he had the careful appearance of a man who never carried his own freight. His boots were polished. His silver watch chain rested neatly across his vest. "Miss Hayes." Lillian said nothing. Pike removed his hat. "I heard there'd been some unpleasantness. That travels quickly. Unfortunately, unpleasant things usually do." A few more people had gathered outside. Pike glanced toward them, then lowered his voice with practiced concern. "You're new here. Pine Creek can be unforgiving. It might be wise to spend some time elsewhere until tempers cool." "Where?" He hesitated. "Cheyenne, perhaps. That's a long ride to make because somebody told a lie." Pike's expression barely moved. Sometimes the truth matters less than what people are prepared to believe. Lillian studied him. 3 days earlier, she had copied a Pike freight invoice because its figures did not agree with the receiving tally. 2 days earlier, she had found another. Yesterday, she had arranged to see Daniel Shaw, and yesterday evening, Pine Creek had suddenly discovered she was pregnant. Lillian bent, picked up her valise, and walked outside. The gathering had grown. She could feel their eyes follow her down the steps. A man near the hitching rail muttered something to his companion. Another asked loudly whether the supposed father planned to come forward. Lillian turned. "If you know his name, sir, you're better informed than I am." The man's grin disappeared. Woman near the general store whispered behind one hand. Another voice came from the porch. "Doesn't much matter now. What respectable man would stand beside her after this?" Harness chains rattled at the far end of the street. A heavy freight wagon rolled through the mud carrying coils of fencing wire and cedar posts. The driver pulled the team down. George Mercer climbed from the wagon. Lillian knew him by sight. Everyone in Pine Creek did. He owned Mercer Ridge, north of Dry Fork, and stood taller than any man she had seen since arriving in Wyoming. He had to duck slightly beneath the freight office awning. His coat stretched across shoulders built by years of cattle work rather than tailoring. The talking stopped before he said a word. George removed one glove, then the other. He looked at Lillian first, not at her stomach, not at the people watching her, at her face. Then he turned to the crowd. "Who's got evidence?" Nobody answered. George waited. The same man who had spoken before shifted against the hitching rail. George looked toward Pike. "Mr. Pike?" Pike gave a thin smile. "Surely you're not asking me to account for every rumor in Pine Creek." No doubt George's voice remained quiet. "Just this one." Pike's smile faded. Someone farther back said, "Mercer, this isn't your concern." George turned his head. The man who had asked what respectable person would stand beside Lillian was still there. George looked at him for a long second. "Then I'll stand by her." No one laughed. Lillian's fingers tightened around the valise handle. George stepped toward her, but stopped with several feet still between them. "I need somebody to go through my winter supply accounts," he said. "Feed bills, freight receipts, cattle tallies." Lillian stared at him. "You're offering me work? I'm offering you wages. Because of this? Because Avery told me last week you found 2 errors in his freight ledger that his own clerk missed." Avery looked uncomfortable in the doorway. George continued. "If you're interested, Mrs. Keegan has a room in her part of the house. You'll be paid for the books. Nothing else." Lillian searched his face for pity. She found none. What happens when people decide your ranch is part of the story? They can decide whatever they please. That isn't an answer. A faint movement touched one corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. "No, it's the only part I can't control." That answer made her look at him again. George reached for her trunk. Lillian put one hand on its handle first. "I can carry my own things." His hand stopped. "All right, no offense, no argument." He simply stepped back. Lillian lifted the trunk herself. Only when its damaged latch sprang open and a folded dress began sliding toward the mud, did George catch the lid with one hand. He held it while she secured the strap. Then he let go. Behind them, Pike had gone very still, Lillian noticed. Mr. Mercer. George looked down at her. I'll take the work. He nodded once. She carried the valise to the wagon before climbing onto the seat without assistance. George loaded the trunk behind her. As he gathered the reins, Lillian finally opened the valise. Her spare blouse was there, her notebook, a Kansas City letter, a narrow envelope containing copies of 3 Pike freight and supply receipts. She counted them. Once, then again, her hand stopped. There should have been 4. The missing copy was the one she had intended to show Daniel Shaw first. Lillian slowly raised her eyes toward the boarding house. Her upstairs window faced the street. The curtain moved slightly behind the glass. George noticed where she was looking. What is it? Lillian closed the valise. The story isn't the only thing that happened last night. His hands became still on the reins. One of my papers is gone. Lost? No. She looked toward Edwin Pike, standing beneath the freight office awning. Someone went into my room. George followed her gaze. For the first time that morning, Lillian saw something hard settle across his face. He did not reach for the revolver at his hip. He did not call Pike's name. He only turned the wagon toward the north road. Then we'd better find out what they were afraid you'd read. The horses moved forward. Pine Creek Crossing slipped behind them, one muddy storefront at a time. Lillian kept the valise against her knees, and all the way toward Mercer Ridge, one thought stayed with her. Someone had worked very hard to make the whole town look at her, which meant there was something else they did not want anyone to see. Lillian kept that thought with her as George Mercer's wagon left Pine Creek Crossing behind. The north road climbed gradually into Juniper Valley, following a line of cottonwoods darkened by the night's rain. Mud clung to the wheels. Water shone in the wagon ruts, and farther west, the mountains stood blue-gray beneath a bank of broken clouds. George did not question her about the missing paper. For nearly 20 minutes, he said nothing at all. Lillian finally turned toward him. You don't want to know what was on it? I figure you'll tell me when you know what matters. She studied his profile. Most men she had worked around disliked unanswered questions. They filled silence with guesses, instructions, or advice nobody had requested. George only drove. What if I don't? Then I suppose I'll remain curious. That almost made her smile. Almost. Mercer Ridge appeared shortly before noon. The ranch sat against the western foothills behind a long split-rail fence. There was a 2-story timber house, 3 barns, a bunkhouse, corrals, a blacksmith shed, and a grain building raised on stone blocks. Beyond them, cattle moved across yellow grass, still wet from the storm. George pulled through the gate. Several ranch hands stopped working. Their eyes moved from him to Lillian. George climbed down. Morning, that was all. The men returned to what they were doing. A gray-haired woman came from the side door of the house, wiping flour from her hands onto a plain brown apron. Martha Keegan, she said. Lillian Hayes. Martha looked at the trunk, then at George. The east room, the room beside yours. Good. No questions. No curious glance toward Lillian's waist. Martha took one end of the trunk before Lillian could protest. You take the other. Mr. Mercer can carry the valise. He needs humbling now and then. George picked it up without comment. The room was small but clean, in the rear section of the house near Martha's own quarters. It held an iron bedstead, a washstand, a narrow wardrobe, and a window facing the kitchen garden. George placed the valise beside the bed. The ranch office is across the hall from the dining room. When do I start? You've had a long morning. That wasn't my question. His eyes rested on hers for a second. After dinner, if you want. I want. He nodded. By 1 o'clock, Lillian was sitting at a scarred oak desk with 3 years of Mercer Ridge accounts stacked around her. George brought the first ledger himself, then another, then a wooden box full of receipts tied in bundles with cotton string. "You keep everything?" "Mostly. Mostly is an expensive word in bookkeeping." He looked at the mountain of paper. "So I'm learning." She untied the first bundle. For 2 hours there was little conversation. Peed corn. Oats, hay, repairs, blacksmith charges, freight from Cheyenne. Lillian made columns on fresh paper, comparing what Mercer Ridge had ordered against what the ranch book said had arrived. Outside, hammers rang from the north fence. At 3:30, she found the first problem. Mr. Mercer. George appeared in the doorway carrying a broken gate hinge. She pointed to an invoice. "Pike billed you for 8 wagon loads of grain on August 6th, if you say so. Your receiving tally says 5. His eyes narrowed. "Could 3 have gone directly to the south pasture? Not according to your feed ledger." She slid another sheet toward him. "Even if they had, these wagons are listed at 70 sacks each. That's heavy. It's more than heavy." She tapped the figures. "It's foolish." George set the hinge down. Lillian took a handful of dried beans from a crock Martha had allowed her to borrow from the pantry. She arranged them across the desk. "Suppose each bean is 10 sacks. This is what Pike says came in." She made one row, then another. "This is what your wagons can reasonably carry over that road without breaking an axle or exhausting the team." George leaned over the desk. The lamplight caught the weathered lines beside his eyes. "That's a fair difference. That's theft if it happened more than once." She opened another ledger. It did. George straightened. "I'll ride into town." "No." He stopped. Lillian looked up at him. "If Pike is doing this deliberately, and you walk into his store asking about false invoices, what will he do? Lie. And after he lies," George considered it, "fix whatever I haven't found yet." "Exactly." He reached for his hat hanging beside the door. Then his hand stopped. For a moment she expected him to ignore her. Instead, he removed his hand from the hat. "How long?" 3 days. That's specific. I dislike asking for time I can't account for." George picked up the broken hinge again. 3 days. He left. Lillian stared after him. There had been no argument, no reminder that Mercer Ridge belonged to him. He had simply recognized that she knew more about the problem and stepped aside. She returned to the papers. By sunset, the differences had become a pattern. The next morning brought clear weather and a hard north wind. Lillian worked at the office window with a cup of coffee cooling beside her. From there, she could see George repairing a section of fence flattened during the storm. He worked beside 2 hired men rather than watching them. At one point, a post slipped. George caught its weight against his shoulder, lowered it carefully, and reset it without shouting at the young hand who had lost his grip. Later that afternoon, George came into the office and found Lillian comparing witness signatures. She placed 3 receipts side by side. "Tell me what you see." He studied them. 3 names. "Don't read them. Look at them." He bent closer. Lillian pointed to the final letter in each signature. Each ended in the same narrow upward hook. "Different men," she said. "Same habit." George looked at her. "You think one person wrote all 3? I think we need more samples before I say that where anybody else can hear me." His gaze remained on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded. That evening, he pulled an empty grain wagon onto the ranch scale himself. Lillian stood beside that scale house with her calculations. They added sacks until the springs settled near the practical load she had estimated. George checked the number, then checked it again. "You were within 40 pounds, 36. He looked over. Lillian raised one eyebrow. 40 sounds careless. Something changed in his face, a small smile. It was gone almost immediately. But she had seen it. For the first time since leaving Pine Creek, she laughed. Only once, quietly. George looked away as though giving her privacy, even from that. On the third morning, Lillian moved to the older receipts. Martha brought coffee and a heel of warm bread, without asking whether she wanted either. "You'll forget breakfast if nobody puts it in your way," she said. "Is that observation or accusation, experience?" Martha left. Lillian smiled and reached for another bundle. May. The paper was creased and stained at one corner. Pike Freight and Supply. 12 wagon loads of grain. Delivery date, May 17, 1888. Route, Cheyenne Road, Dry Fork Crossing, Mercer Ridge. Lillian stopped chewing. She read it again. Then she opened her valise. At the bottom, beneath her Kansas City letter, was a folded piece of newspaper she had saved because it concerned freight delays. She flattened it beside the receipt. The notice was dated May 13th. Dry Fork Bridge lost to spring flood. The article said the structure had washed away on the night of May 11th. Freight traffic had been diverted south until repairs were completed. Lillian knew the rest because she had copied the June freight notices herself. The bridge had not reopened until June 7th. She laid the receipt beside the clipping. May 17th, 12 wagons, across a bridge that did not exist. Her pulse quickened. Then she noticed something else. A small mark sat near the lower right edge of the Pike receipt. Not a letter. More like two short strokes crossed by a third. She had seen it before. Lillian opened the envelope containing the remaining copies she had carried from Pine Creek. First page. Nothing. Second. There. The same mark. Third. Again. She heard George's boots in the hall. He appeared at the doorway, sleeves rolled to his forearms, a length of leather rein in one hand. Lillian did not look up immediately. "What did you find?" She slid the newspaper toward him, then the receipt. George read both. His jaw tightened. 12 wagons, 6 days after Dry Fork Bridge went into the creek. They could have taken South Bend, then Pike wouldn't have written Dry Fork on the route line. And 12 loaded grain wagons using South Bend would have added almost 2 days. Your ranch journal records rain that week and no late delivery. George looked at the small mark she indicated. "What is that?" "I don't know yet." She pulled out the other copies, but it appears on papers from 3 different ranch accounts. George rested both hands on the desk. The wood gave a faint creak beneath his weight. Lillian looked at the receipts spread between them. The missing paper from her boarding room no longer felt like an isolated theft. Neither did the rumor, nor the figures in Mercer's books. She touched the impossible date with one finger. "This isn't somebody padding one invoice." George's eyes moved across the papers. "No," Lillian folded the newspaper slowly. "Mercer Ridge isn't the only ranch they're doing this to." Outside, the wind pushed through the cottonwoods and sent dry leaves scraping across the yard. George looked toward the distant road leading back to Pine Creek. 3 days earlier, Lillian had asked him not to ride into town. This time he did not reach for his hat. He looked at her instead. "What do we do next?" Lillian gathered the receipts into one stack. "We find the people who were supposed to receive the other loads." And for the first time since George Mercer had stood beside her in Pine Creek, Lillian understood that something had changed. He was no longer giving her a place to hide from a lie. He was trusting her to lead them toward the truth. The next morning, Lillian rode south with George toward Frank Ellis's place. The trail left Mercer Ridge through a stand of cottonwoods, crossed 2 shallow draws, and then narrowed along a line of low red bluffs. The air had turned colder overnight. Frost still clung to the shaded grass, and each horse's breath showed white before fading. Frank Ellis's ranch looked tired before they ever reached the gate. One barn leaned slightly east. A windmill creaked without turning. 2 milk cows stood near a fence patched with mismatched boards. Frank came out of the house wearing a wool vest over his work shirt. He saw George first, then Lillian. His expression changed. Not unkindly, just carefully. George noticed, Miss Hayes is handling my accounts. Frank scratched his gray beard. So I heard. Lillian dismounted before either man could help her. I need to ask about grain deliveries from Pike Freight and Supply. Frank's shoulders tightened. Come inside. The kitchen smelled of boiled coffee and bacon grease. A ledger sat beneath a folded newspaper at the far end of the table. Frank pulled out a chair for Lillian. She set down 3 copied receipts. These are listed under your account. He studied them. I never saw that much grain. This one says 6 wagon loads in March. I got 3. This one says 8 in April, 4. Maybe 5 if you count the damaged sacks. George leaned against the wall near the stove, arms folded. Lillian watched Frank's hands. They trembled slightly when she slid the final paper toward him. And this promissory note? Frank did not touch it. Pike says I owe him $940. Do you? I owe something. How much? Closer to $500. Lillian kept her voice even. Do you have your original receipts? Frank gave a short laugh without humor. Had them. What happened? Roof leaked last spring. Box got wet. Some papers ruined. Some? He looked at her. The ones that would have helped most. Silence settled over the table. George's jaw tightened, but he stayed where he was. Lillian folded her hands. Did Pike offer to buy your land? Frank's eyes moved toward George. Not the land. What then? The west water access. Lillian glanced at George. Frank continued. Dry years. That creek keeps the north pasture alive. Pike said he'd forgive part of the debt if I signed over use rights. There it was. Not just money. Control. Lillian gathered the papers. How long before he can act on the note? 3 weeks. George pushed away from the wall. He won't get that water. Frank looked at him. You can't pay everybody's debts, George. No, Lillian answered before he could. But we may be able to prove some of them were never real. On the ride back, George was quiet for nearly a mile. Then he said, I should have seen it. Lillian looked over. Seen what? Pike buying leverage instead of land. You run cattle. He runs paper. George gave her a sidelong look. That's supposed to make me feel better. No. That earned the smallest breath of a laugh. By the time they reached Pine Creek, the street was busy with freight traffic. Lillian wanted to stop at the county office to compare older notices. George wanted to avoid giving Pike any reason to think they were building a case. They compromised. George went to the blacksmith. Lillian entered the county office alone. Daniel Shaw sat behind a tall counter with a stack of deeds beside him. He looked tired and cautious. Miss Hayes, Mr. Shaw, I heard you were staying at Mercer Ridge. I am working there. A slight pause. Yes, of course. Lillian set down her notebook. I need to see public freight notices from March through June. Daniel hesitated. Anything in particular? If I knew that, I wouldn't need the notices. He looked at her for a second, then nodded toward a shelf. Back wall, second drawer. She spent 40 minutes copying dates. When she came out, Lucy Pike was standing beside a flour barrel near the mercantile. Their eyes met. Lucy looked away first. Lillian remembered seeing her weeks earlier behind Pike's counter, sorting invoices with a pencil tucked behind one ear. That evening, back at Mercer Ridge, a rider arrived carrying a sealed envelope. George read it standing in the yard. Lillian watched the muscles in his face harden. What is it? He handed her the paper. Pike Freight and Supply, demand for early repayment, an old loan. George took the notice back. Winter of '86, you borrowed from him? Lost more cattle than I could replace. Needed feed, needed cash. How much? Enough. Lillian looked at him. That's not a number, no. He folded the letter once, then again. A ranch hand called from the barn. George tucked the paper inside his coat. We'll talk later. But they didn't, not that night. The next morning, a cattle buyer from Laramie sent word that he was delaying a purchase from Mercer Ridge until current uncertainties were settled. By noon, Lillian understood. The rumor had reached beyond Pine Creek. George's decision to stand beside her had begun costing him money. She found him near the tack room, replacing a broken stirrup leather. "I should leave." George kept working. "That's so? If I stay here, Pike keeps using me against you. He was using you before you came here. He wasn't using me to threaten your ranch." George threaded their leather through the buckle. Lillian waited. He finished the knot before looking up. Then he walked to the office, returned with her employment contract, and placed it on the workbench between them. "You can leave whenever you want." Lillian's face tightened. "I know. But don't leave because Pike wants me afraid of the price of standing beside you." The wind moved dust along the yard. George rested one hand beside the contract. "This says you work here because you're good at the books. It doesn't say you owe me your reputation, your choices, or your future." Lillian looked down at the paper, then folded it carefully. Once, twice. She tucked it beneath her arm. "I'll need the South freight receipts after supper." George nodded. "All right." 3 days later, they rode toward an abandoned feed shed near the lower foothills. It had once served as a transfer point before a newer road cut 2 miles east. The roof sagged. One wall leaned outward. Inside, old grain dust still clung to the boards. Lillian found chalk marks near a post and a broken tally board beneath a pile of warped planks. On the ride back, clouds gathered over the western ridge. Rain from the night before had left the slope slick. Lillian's mare stepped onto a flat stone. The stone shifted. The horse lurched sideways. Lillian lost one stirrup. George was off his own horse before she fully understood what was happening. One arm caught her across the ribs as the mare stumbled. For a second her boots left the ground, then George set her down, not dropped, not held. Set. The moment her feet were steady, his hand released her. "You hurt?" "No. You sure?" "Yes." Her heart was still beating hard. George stepped back. He checked the mare's foreleg, then the saddle strap. Lillian looked at his hand. Broad, scarred, strong enough to lift her without effort. Yet he had let go before she needed to ask. That stayed with her longer than the fear. They reached Mercer Ridge near dusk. A woman was waiting beside the back gate. Lucy Pike. She wore a dark shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. George started toward her. Lucy shook her head. "Miss Hayes, alone, please." George looked at Lillian. She nodded once. He stepped away without argument. Lucy waited until he was out of hearing. "My brother knows you copied one of his invoices." Lillian said nothing. "He found out the day before the rumor started." "How? I saw you." Lillian's eyes sharpened. Lucy looked ashamed. "I mentioned it. I didn't know what he would do." "The stable boy," Lucy nodded. "Edwin paid him to say he'd heard you were expecting." The words landed quietly. No thunder, no crowd, just the creak of the gate behind them. Lillian's fingers tightened around her glove. "So it was never about me." Lucy looked at her. "It was about getting you gone." Lillian drew a slow breath. "What is he afraid I'll find?" Lucy's face changed. "Not the copies, then what?" Lucy looked toward the dark outline of the ranch house. "My brother has something better." Lillian waited. Lucy swallowed. Something with Mr. Mercer's real signature on it. The cold seemed to sharpen. Lillian did not move. "What kind of something? A note? Promissory?" Lucy nodded. "He says if George Mercer tries to accuse him of fraud, he'll put that paper in front of the county clerk." Lillian stared toward the house. A lamp had come on in the office window. George's silhouette crossed it once, then disappeared. For days, she had been learning to trust what he did not say. Now, for the first time, his silence looked different. Not steady, not careful, possibly hidden. Lucy pulled her shawl tighter. I've said too much. She turned toward the road. Lillian stopped her. One question. Lucy looked back. Is the signature real? A pause. Then, yes. Lucy walked away. Lillian remained beside the gate. Behind her, George opened the back door. Everything all right? She turned slowly. His face was half lit by the lamp behind him. The man who had stood beside her when Pine Creek called her a liar. The man who had trusted her with his books. The man who had just lost business because of her name. And somewhere in Edwin Pike's possession was a document bearing George Mercer's real signature. Lillian looked at him for a long moment, then at the office window. No, she said. Not yet. George stayed in the doorway. He did not ask Lucy Pike's name. He did not ask what she had said. Lillian walked past him into the ranch office, removed her gloves, and set them carefully beside the ledger. Close the door, George did. The room smelled of lamp oil, paper, and the coffee Martha had left on the stove an hour earlier. Wind pressed once against the window and moved on. Lillian opened her notebook. Do you know a Pike promissory note connected to your name? George's face gave her the answer before his voice did. Yes. Lillian looked down. She had hoped for surprise. What number? 47. She turned the notebook around, the number Lucy had given her. George pulled out the chair opposite the desk, but did not sit. How much do you know? Enough to ask why you didn't tell me. He looked toward the window. Winter of '86 was bad. That isn't what I asked. No, he sat. We lost cattle before Christmas. Then another storm came in January. Hay ran short. I had men to pay and animals left that weren't going to survive February without feed. So you borrowed from Pike? Yes. How much? 4,000. Lillian's pencil stopped. That was not a casual debt. What did you sign? A note secured against part of the cattle herd. 12% interest. Payment after 2 shipping seasons. Land. No. Water rights? No. Mercer Ridge itself? No. You're certain? George met her eyes. I read that much before I signed. And the note Pike has now, I haven't seen it. Lucy has. His expression changed slightly, so he had guessed who came to the gate. She says your signature is real. It probably is. Lillian pushed back from the desk. You say that as if it doesn't matter. It matters. Then why didn't you tell me? George's mouth tightened. Because it was my debt. We are examining altered debts. Frank Ellis's, the other ranches, and yours, apparently. George said nothing. Lillian stood. For the first time since coming to Mercer Ridge, the size of him made the room feel smaller. Not because she feared him, because he had been standing beside her all these days while keeping a locked door inside himself. You asked me to trust your books. I gave you the books. You gave me the books you decided I needed. He looked down at his hands. That silence irritated her more than an argument would have. You don't get to decide what I need to know and then call it protection. I wasn't protecting you. Then what were you doing? His answer took too long. Handling my own trouble. Lillian let out a quiet breath. There it is. George looked up. You think carrying everything alone makes the burden disappear? No. Then why do it? His jaw worked once. Habit. The word was plain enough to take some of the anger out of her. Not all of it. Do you have your original note? No. Ought a copy? No. Any correspondence from the loan? Maybe. Where? George looked toward the office wall, then he stood and left. Lillian remained beside the desk. A minute later, he returned carrying a dark wooden box with iron corners. It was heavier than it looked. He placed it in front of her. From his pocket, he took a small brass key. He unlocked the box. Inside were tax receipts, bank drafts, cattle contracts, private letters, old loan papers, and records she had never seen. George left the key on top, all of it, Lillian looked at him. You don't have to. Yes. He stepped away from the desk. I should have done it the first day. That was the closest thing to an apology he had offered. It was enough for the moment. Lillian sat. Then help me sort it. They worked until midnight. No original Pike note appeared. But there were letters from the winter of '86, receipts for emergency hay, and a bank draft matching George's account of the loan. Enough to support him. Not enough to prove Pike had changed anything. 2 days later, Daniel Shaw sent notice that a county hearing would be held Friday morning regarding disputed debt filings from Frank Ellis and 2 neighboring ranches. Pike had requested that his own records be entered. The night before the hearing, snow dusted the highest foothills. At Mercer Ridge, the stove clicked softly as it cooled. Lillian sat at the office desk making 3 complete sets of copies. One for Daniel, one for herself. One to remain at the ranch. She was not losing another paper. Across from her, George repaired a split harness strap. His large hands worked the awl through the leather with surprising patience. Neither had spoken for several minutes. Lillian sanded a fresh page, shook off the excess, then flexed her aching fingers. George slid his coffee toward her. She looked at it. You haven't touched it. I don't need it. You made it. I made 2. Lillian wrapped both hands around the cup. It was still warm. What happens if they believe him tomorrow? George pulled another stitch tight. Who? Everybody. He did not look up. Tomorrow doesn't decide who you are. Lillian watched him. The awl passed through the leather again. A pause. And it doesn't decide whether I stand beside you. Her fingers tightened around the cup. She wanted to say something. Nothing she could think of improved the silence. So she drank the coffee. Friday morning came cold and clear. Pine Creek Crossing looked different from the wagon. Or perhaps Lillian did. People noticed her beside George. A few stopped talking. Others simply watched. George pulled up outside the county office. Lillian climbed down on her own. Inside, Daniel Shaw had arranged chairs along one wall. Frank Ellis sat near the front, holding his hat between both hands. 2 other ranchers stood by the stove. Edwin Pike was already there. He wore a charcoal coat and a fresh collar. A leather document case rested on the table before him. Miss Hayes, he said pleasantly. Lillian removed her gloves. Mr. Pike, Daniel called the room to order. The hearing was not the trial. He made that clear. His task was to determine whether the disputed filings could proceed or whether they required further county review. Lillian began with numbers, Frank's grain deliveries, Mercer Ridge's inflated invoices, wagon capacities, the impossible May 17th crossing at Dry Fork. She placed the newspaper notice beside Pike's receipt. Daniel read both twice. Pike did not interrupt. That worried her. When Frank testified that he had received fewer loads than Pike billed, Edwin merely wrote something on a sheet of paper. Then he stood. Mistakes happen in freight records. 12 wagons don't cross a missing bridge by mistake, Lillian said. Pike smiled faintly. Perhaps not. He opened the leather case. But since Miss Hayes wishes to discuss the integrity of my accounts, perhaps we should discuss the integrity of the man employing her. George's expression did not change. Pike removed a folded document. Lillian knew before he opened it. Note 47, Daniel took the paper. His eyebrows drew together. Mr. Mercer. George stepped forward. Daniel turned the note toward him. Is this your signature? The room became quiet. Frank stopped moving his hat. Lillian could hear the stove ticking. George studied the document. For 1 second, then 2. He did not look at Pike. He did not look at Lillian. Yes, Daniel leaned forward. You're certain? George's voice was steady. That is my signature. Frank lowered his eyes. One of the ranchers shifted his chair. Pike closed his document case. Lillian felt the floor of the argument move beneath her. She stepped closer to Daniel's desk. "May I see it?" Daniel hesitated, then handed her the note. The signature was strong and unmistakable. George Mercer. Lillian had seen it on cattle contracts and bank drafts while she read the terms: land security, water access. Default provisions George had sworn were never in the original. Pike watched her. "I believe that settles the question of whether Mr. Mercer has been entirely forthcoming." Lillian did not answer. She turned the page toward the window. Morning light fell across the fibers, something caught near the lower margin. Small, faint, a mark inside the paper itself. She moved closer to the glass, her breathing slowed. "Mr. Shaw," Daniel was gathering the other documents. "I'm going to suspend this hearing until—" "Don't." He looked up. Lillian held the note toward the light again. The signature was not wrong. That was the mistake they had all been making. She rubbed one thumb lightly along the edge of the sheet. Then she saw it, a tiny watermark pressed into the rag paper. Lillian looked at Pike. For the first time that morning, his expression had changed. Only slightly, but enough. "Mr. Shaw," she said, keeping her eyes on Edwin Pike. "Don't close this hearing." Daniel frowned. "Why?" Laid the note flat on his desk. "Because Mr. Mercer's signature isn't the problem." George looked at her. She touched the paper. "This is—" Daniel Shaw looked from Lillian to the promissory note. "The paper?" "Yes," Edwin Pike gave a quiet laugh. "We have stopped discussing debts and begun discussing stationery?" Lillian ignored him. "Mr. Shaw, do you still keep merchant freight notices from Cheyenne?" "Most of them. I need Pike Freight and Supplies supply entries from last year." Daniel hesitated. Pike stepped forward. "On what authority?" Daniel looked at him. "This is a county hearing concerning documents you've submitted for foreclosure. I think I can look at the paper they're written on." That silenced the room. Daniel went to the records cabinet. Lillian kept note 47 beneath the window. The watermark was faint. A small manufacturer's device pressed into the fibers. She had seen the same paper before, not at Mercer Ridge, at the freight office. Daniel returned carrying a bound register. Lillian turned pages until she found the entry. October 1887, stationery shipment from Cheyenne. 4 reams rag paper. She pointed to the manufacturer's description, then to the watermark. Daniel leaned closer. George remained behind her. He had not spoken once. "This note is dated February 1887, Lillian said. "Pike didn't receive this paper until 8 months later." Pike's face hardened. "That proves nothing. Paper can be purchased elsewhere, then show us the earlier purchase. I don't keep every scrap of business history to satisfy a clerk's imagination." Lillian finally looked at him. "No, but freight offices do." Daniel's eyes remained on the register. Lillian examined the note again. Near George's signature, the fibers looked slightly different. The lower section had been trimmed unusually close, and a fine seam showed where the signed portion met the larger sheet. She did not claim magic. She asked for a ruler. Daniel handed her one. Lillian measured the margins. Then she took one of George's old bank drafts from her evidence folder. Same signature, same heavy downward stroke in the M. She placed the documents side by side. "Mr. Mercer signed something," George answered from behind her. "I did." Lillian nodded. "And I believe this is part of it," she indicated the lower portion. "But these terms were written later on paper Pike could not have possessed on the date printed here." Frank Ellis leaned forward. "You mean he cut George's name off another paper?" "I mean the signed portion came from a genuine document. The rest did not." Daniel lifted the note carefully. The room had become so quiet that footsteps outside sounded loud through the floorboards. Pike recovered first. "One questionable sheet doesn't erase legitimate debts." "No," Lillian said. She opened her case. "That is why I brought the rest." She placed the May receipt on the desk. 12 grain wagons through Dry Fork Bridge on May 17th, then the newspaper notice. The bridge washed out May 11th. Next came the wagon calculations. The loads Pike billed Mercer Ridge for were larger than the wagons listed on his own manifests could reasonably carry. Then the 3 witness signatures, 3 names, same final stroke. Frank stood, and I never received what he charged me for. Pike turned sharply. Frank did not sit down. I received 3 loads in March. Not 6, 4 in April, maybe 5, not 8. Daniel opened another file. What about the Ellis note? Lillian answered. If the debt total was built from inflated invoices, then the amount itself needs review before anyone takes his land or water access. Daniel sat back. The evidence did not make a dramatic sound. No gunshot, no shout, just paper touching wood, but everyone in the room understood what had changed. Daniel reached for a blank county form, pending review. I'm suspending the Ellis foreclosure filing and the 2 related claims. Pike's face went pale. You cannot do that based on her word. I'm doing it based on records. Daniel dipped his pen, and I'm requesting that the relevant Pike freight and supply books remain available for county examination. Pike stared at Lillian. Then he made the mistake she had been waiting for. This from a woman Pine Creek threw out of a boarding house because even decent people knew what she was. George moved, only half a step. Lillian raised one hand without looking back. He stopped. She faced Pike herself. A lie about me does not make these numbers true. Nothing more. She did not defend her virtue. She did not explain where she slept or who she knew. She simply pushed the false receipt toward Daniel. Pike had no answer for it. When the hearing ended, people left slowly. Frank Ellis stopped beside Lillian. He held his hat against his chest. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I. My place safe? For now. He nodded. That'll do for today. Outside, cold sunlight filled Pine Creek. George came down the county office steps behind her. For several yards they walked without speaking. Then he said, You believed me. Lillian stopped. No. George looked at her. She turned to face him. I checked. A faint line appeared between his brows. Then she added, And what I found gave me reason to believe you. Something in his face eased. That sounds more like you. It should. They continued toward the wagon. At the hitching rail, George reached for her elbow as she stepped around a patch of frozen mud. Then he remembered. His hand stopped. Lillian noticed. She stepped across by herself. Afterward, she touched his sleeve once, a small thing, but he looked down at where her fingers had been. By November, Pike's disputed claims were still under review. There was no grand arrest in Pine Creek. No crowd gathered to apologize. Life was less tidy than that. Mrs. Talbot sent Lillian's boarding house trunk key through a boy from the bakery. She did not come herself. Lillian slipped the key into a drawer and never returned to the boarding house. A few townspeople still looked away when she passed. Others began saying good morning again. She accepted both without slowing. More important, Frank Ellis brought her 2 account books. Then another rancher brought a deed to be copied. A freight operator asked whether she could reconcile 3 months of receipts. She could. By early December, Lillian had enough saved to rent a narrow room beside the saddler's shop. The front window was scratched, and one floorboard near the stove squeaked. She rented it anyway. A painter from the next street lettered the glass in white. Lillian Hayes' accounts and copying George stood across the street while the paint dried. You're staring, reading. You've been reading at 10 minutes. I read slow. She laughed. He came to her office the next week carrying invoices, real ones. I need these checked. You have a ranch ledger. I've been informed mostly is an expensive word in bookkeeping. Lillian looked up sharply. George's face remained perfectly straight. She pointed to the chair. Sit down. That became the beginning of his courtship. Not flowers every morning, not speeches, work, coffee, occasional rides after she locked the office. Sometimes George waited outside without entering while she finished with a customer. He never assumed her evening belonged to him. One cold evening, they reached the place where the road divided. East went toward town. North, toward Mercer Ridge, their horses stood quietly beneath a sky crowded with stars. George removed his hat. "The first day I stood beside you, I did it because they had no right to bury a person under words." Lillian waited. His horse shifted. George steadied the reins. "I still stand here because I want to." Lillian looked at him. "If I don't choose you?" George lowered his head slightly. "Then you don't." He did not move closer. That mattered. Lillian had spent months watching the strongest man she knew learn when not to reach. So she did. She leaned across the small space between the horses and kissed him. Briefly at first, then she stayed close enough to see surprise soften his face. "You can breathe, Mr. Mercer. I was working on it." She laughed against the cold. By early spring of 1889, Juniper Valley had begun turning green again. Mud replaced snow along Pine Creek's streets. Freight wagons returned from Cheyenne. The cottonwoods showed their first pale leaves. Lillian's office now held 2 shelves of ledgers, a brass scale, fresh paper, and 3 waiting customers on a busy Tuesday afternoon. George arrived with mud on his boots. He stopped outside. Through the window, Lillian saw him lean against the porch post and wait. He did not enter until the last customer left. "You know you can come inside. You were working. So, you don't interrupt me when I'm moving cattle. Your cattle don't charge by the hour." Maybe they should. She locked the office. Together they walked down the same street where her trunk had once sat in the dirt. The freight office was closing. Someone swept the bakery steps. Nobody whispered, or if they did, Lillian no longer listened for it. George glanced back at her painted window. "Ever think you'll go back to Kansas?" Lillian looked west. Beyond the roofs, Juniper Valley opened beneath the foothills, green returning where winter had stripped everything bare. Not anymore. They walked a little farther. Lillian still carried the old brown valise. The handle had been repaired twice. Now it held her own account books. She touched it. They said I came here carrying something shameful. George looked at her. Lillian lifted the valise slightly. They were right about one thing. I was carrying something. He waited. She smiled. They just never guessed it was the truth. George held out his hand. He did not take hers. He simply left his palm open between them. Lillian looked at it, then placed her hand in his. They passed the end of Pine Creek Crossing and followed the road north, toward the long fence lines of Mercer Ridge. Months earlier, George Mercer had stood beside a woman when nobody else would. Later, when his own name came under suspicion, she had stood beside him. Now neither was rescuing the other. Neither owed the other a life. That was what made the choice matter. Behind them, the town grew smaller. Ahead, evening light spread across Juniper Valley, touching the wet road, the open grass, and the distant foothills. Lillian's valise swung gently at her side. George's hand remained around hers, loose enough that she could let go whenever she wished. She didn't, and maybe that was the truest part of their story. Lillian had arrived in Juniper Valley carrying little more than a valise, a careful eye for numbers, and the determination to build a life under her own name. George had spent years believing strength meant carrying every burden alone. By spring, neither of them was the person who had first stood on that muddy street in Pine Creek. He had learned that protecting someone was not the same as choosing for them. She had learned that accepting another person's hand did not mean surrendering her independence. What grew between them was never built on rescue. It was built in quieter places, in ledgers spread across a wooden desk, in truths that were difficult to admit, in the space George gave Lillian to make her own choices. And in the moment, she chose to stand beside him when his name was the one under suspicion. Sometimes dignity is not restored when the people who judged you finally apologize. Sometimes it returns when their judgment stops deciding where you go next. And sometimes love becomes real only after both people are free enough to walk away. Lillian could have. George would have let her. She stayed. If you had been in Lillian's place, would you have trusted George enough to choose him after everything they endured? And if stories about courage, quiet love, second chances, and the hidden truths of the American West mean something to you, subscribe and stay with us. There are more roads ahead, and more stories waiting beyond the next ridge.